Often organizations are putting in place solutions that are not tied to the problem, and then those solutions don't work, and they say that diversity efforts don't work. If we think about being in an organization and what organizations should do, it's really important that we think about who's making up this organization, because our peers do influence us. People want to live in a society where there is equality, where those people with differences are able to succeed, and they like working for companies that are engaged in this work. I'm Ivy Oñato. I'm a Harvard Business School Biggs Racial Equity Fellow this year, and I'm an assistant professor of management and organizations at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. In my research, I study diversity, discrimination, and inequality. I study these topics in organizations and in society writ large. And what I'm most interested in is how people perceive inequality and what kinds of things we can do to help people be more willing and motivated to address inequality in organizations. Based on my research, I think there's three major myths that I want to talk about and dispel. The first is that there's widespread resistance to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And based on lots of work that I've done and that other people have done, we actually find that there's widespread support for diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. People want to live in a society where there is equality, where those people with differences are able to succeed, and they like working for companies that are engaged in this work. And many companies are engaged in this work. The second myth that I want to talk about today is the idea that diversity and meritocracy are at odds. In America, we're operating in a multiracial democracy. There are many different types of people who live in America, who buy products, and who work at companies. And thus, companies actually need to engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion programming, policies, programs, so that they can operate at their highest potential. For instance, if I own a company and I'm selling a particular product and I want to sell it to the most number of people possible, it might be useful for me as a company to have a team that is focused on marketing to different constituents. In addition, I might be hiring people with different backgrounds or from different parts of the world, and it would be useful for my HR team to understand how these different employees are experiencing this company and what issues the company might be facing, and to be able to address those issues so that all of my employees can thrive in my company. And then finally, the last myth is that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs don't work. Based on my research and my work, I argue that it's not that they don't work, it's that we're often putting in place interventions and programs that are expected to change big things in the organization, the number of women in the C-suite, the number of Black people that have been hired, and we're putting in place things like diversity trainings, which do not directly change those factors. In order to change something like the number of women who are being promoted, you need to put in place shifts in the promotion policies that would actually address that. A training on its own is not going to be able to change those types of things. In today's environment, more than ever, people are concerned about whether engaging in diversity, equity, and inclusion in their companies is illegal. There have been executive orders that have been issued that have argued that diversity is counter to the Civil Rights Act. And that's a myth in that the Civil Rights Act was put in place to reduce inequality. And so efforts to reduce inequality cannot be illegal and counter to the Civil Rights Act. And so I would like to encourage business leaders to push back on these efforts to hamstring their attempts to address inequality within their own organizations. If we totally eradicate all of the diversity, equity, and inclusion programming in companies in the private sector and the federal government, then that eliminates and reduces the ability for companies to manage the work that they have to do and to operate at their highest potential. Based on my research, I would say that best practices for organizations that want to engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion would be to first identify what the problem is. Oftentimes, organizations are instituting diversity policies, programs, trainings without identifying exactly what problem they're trying to solve for. And so you might identify that you have an issue with hiring women or promoting Black people in your company. But if you don't identify that that's the problem, you won't be able to select an intervention that would directly address that problem. So you might institute a company-wide diversity training, hoping that somehow that increases the number of women that are managers in your company. But there's no connection between diversity trainings and increasing the number of women managers. In order to do that, you would need to choose an intervention that would specifically address why women aren't being promoted in the company. What I found that organizational leaders often miss is that there's actually more support for diversity initiatives than people expect. So organizational leaders are often very concerned about resistance to diversity efforts. And so they preemptively water down or weaken the diversity interventions that they put in place because they're worried about backlash from certain employees. And there are certain employees who may be upset about diversity initiatives, but actually the majority of Americans, of people in companies, support diversity efforts. When I speak to business leaders, they often flag for me that this diversity work is really important, that they need to understand their clientele, they need to understand their employees, and they need to understand how to create a climate where all can feel welcome and operate at their best. In one of my recent research projects, we were interested in how the average American responds to organizational diversity messages, in line with this concern that maybe there's widespread resistance to these messages. Actually, what we found was widespread support. We were also interested in whether there were group differences by race or political ideology in terms of organizational diversity messages. And what we found surprised us and may surprise you. Although there are group differences, on average, people were supportive of diversity messages. And even Republicans who are perceived as being anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion were not unsupportive of these diversity messages. If anything, maybe there was some ambivalence. And so the takeaway from that research is that rather than being concerned about widespread resistance, organizational leaders who want to engage in diversity efforts can trust that their constituents do actually care about this, and that the people who are highly resistant to diversity efforts are a small subset of the population. I would also say that rather than trying to create diversity initiatives that might not make people defensive or something like that in advance, that organizational leaders try to think about how they can be persuasive, how they can connect the value of these diversity efforts to people who might be resistant. One example that I think is really interesting is that there are policies that are now in place that arise from diversity concerns, but now help everybody. So unlimited PTO, for instance. That's instituted to ensure that you don't need to tell me why you need to take a leave. You can take your leave. You might need to care for elderly parents, et cetera. These are all diversity concerns, but they help everyone to have the flexibility to take the leave that they need. Maternity leave was initially just offered to women who gave birth. And now often companies have extended it to fathers, extended it to people who are adopting, and then extended it to caregiving leave. So these policies that are initially about a subset or a certain group of people, when they're applied more broadly, allow everyone to have the flexibility to do what they need to do and excel at work. Based on my research, there are some failures that companies are engaging in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion policies. I think they're often couched as about one specific group. They're couched as some people benefiting in a zero-sum manner. So some people benefiting and other people are being harmed. I think a more useful way to frame them is that this is expanding the pie. This is allowing for more opportunities, and that often everybody can participate. So take employee resource groups, for instance. Generally, anybody can join in and participate in these organizations. It's not legal to sort of say that based on race, somebody cannot participate in the groups. But because that's not well understood, these employee resource groups, diversity policies and programs are being couched as racial preferences and things like that, when in general, anybody can come to this Lunar New Year celebration or whatever the case might be. And so I think it's important for companies to defend these policies and programs that they've had in place and the value of them for not just the employees who are being directly appealed to, but a broader set of employees, their entire set of employees. I think what's important is to make the case that, again, nobody is excluded from being able to participate in these ERGs, and that they provide vital services for employees. They provide access to mentorship, access to resources, professional development, so that these companies can make the most out of the employees that they have there. Right now, we have several executive orders that have been issued that challenge the right of organizations to engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, policies, et cetera. One of the major challenges potentially economically is that organizations that don't have these positions in place won't be able to operate at their full potential. But again, these employees also focus on who is in the organization, the climate of the organization. And based on some of my research, we find that the contact that people have during a time of training or an initial engagement with the field is related long-term to their racial biases. So the more contact and high quality contact that people have with Black people during, a time of training is related to less implicit and explicit bias. So if organizations no longer have these programs or have diversity in their organizations, that might lead to an increase in racial bias over time. In terms of what should I do right now, especially if you're trying to engage in this work, I think it's really important that we stay the course. This isn't the first time in history that there's been resistance to efforts towards progress for people who were not previously included. We need to think through how can we make the case so that people with varying perspectives understand the value of this work and don't feel excluded from this work. Diversity, equity, inclusion programs are not just for liberals. They're not just for people of color. All of us make up the diverse tapestry in organizations, every person. And so these policies, these efforts are meant for all of us. And if we're doing this work, I think it's important for us to think about how we're messaging on them and how we can ensure that everyone is seeing the value of them and that people are clear about what's actually happening in organizations. So to the extent that there are misperceptions that illegal behavior is going on, it's important for us to clarify illegal behavior is not going on. Simply having an ERG group is not illegal. It is not a quota. It's not a preference. It's simply an opportunity to connect around a shared interest. And anybody with that shared interest is able to participate in these programs. In other research that I conduct, we followed physicians over the course of their training, and we were interested in what experiences during medical school might influence their racial biases in the long term. So we surveyed these physicians at the beginning of medical school and got a sense of their contact with people from different backgrounds before medical school, their racial bias at the beginning of medical school. And then we surveyed them again at the end of medical school, getting those same measures, and then also an assessment of things that happened during medical school. Did you have contact with Black people during medical school? Did you see racial bias from your attendings, from your faculty members, from your peers? And finally, did you engage in diversity training at all while you were in medical school? In addition, we also actually assessed their perceptions of the climate of the medical school. And then we surveyed them again 2 years later after they're done with medical school when they're in residency. And we were interested in whether these experiences that they had during medical school while they're undergoing their training, preparing to enter the profession, would still have an impact 2 years later when they're in residency, they've received their medical degrees. And what we found is that contact with Black people during medical school was related to less implicit bias and explicit bias measured 2 years later during residency in a different organization. There's a few things that I think are really important about that. The experiences that people are having within organizations are having a long-term impact. So this assault on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts will have a long-term impact for individuals. The second thing that's interesting is that we didn't find a relationship between the number of hours of diversity training that people said that they engaged in and their racial biases 2 years later. Instead, that high quality contact with Black people during medical school is what had the strongest relationship to their biases 2 years later. Right now, I'm interested in what other factors in the organization might also shape racial biases. And so we have access to data about the average racial bias in the region where the medical school is, the average racial bias at that medical school, and then an index of each medical school's social mission score, so their commitment to a social mission. And there we found that each medical school's commitment to their social mission was related to the average bias of medical students in their first year. So the more committed they were to a social mission, the lower bias medical students at that medical school had, suggesting that either low bias medical students are attracted to schools with that are committed to a social mission, or that schools that are committed to a social mission are selecting less biased medical students. Based on our data set, we can't distinguish between those two, but regardless, there is a relationship, suggesting that the organization's norms and what they're actually doing is influential in terms of determining who makes up this organization. Next, we were interested in what is related to change over time amongst these medical students. So they're this level of bias at the beginning of medical school. They may become more biased by the end or less biased by the end. What predicts that? Is it the racial bias in the region where their medical school is? Is it the racial bias at that school? Or is it this institutional commitment to a social mission? And what we found is that actually the racial bias of their cohort is what's most predictive of the change in bias over the course of medical school. So people in medical schools where the cohort is more biased become more biased over time. So there is an influence of who is around you. And so again, if we think about being in an organization and what organizations should do, it's really important that we think about who's making up this organization, because our peers do influence us. Your environment matters in two ways. First, positive quality contact with people different than you can shape your attitudes towards those groups. In particular, quality contact with Black people is related to less implicit and explicit bias measured later when you're even in a different organization. The second way that your environment can shape your racial biases is that if you're in an organization that's more biased, over time, you do become more biased as well. And so if we don't have access to diversity, equity, and inclusion programming in organizations, then those organizations may become more biased and lead individuals to be more biased, which has really negative repercussions for society writ large. Based on my research, there are several actionable steps that business leaders should take as they attempt to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organizations. The first and most important thing is to specifically identify the problem that you're trying to solve. That then determines the rest of your strategy with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The second thing is to take a measurable baseline of where you stand on this issue. Then based on your identification of the problem and your identification of why this problem is occurring, you can address and design a solution that is particularly tailored to that issue. Often organizations are putting in place solutions that are not tied to the problem, and then those solutions don't work, and they say that diversity efforts don't work. But instead, what I encourage business leaders to think about is what exactly is the problem, why is it going on, and how can we specifically address it? The third thing that's really important is measurement. We need to understand where we are at baseline, and then after we implement our proposed solution, we can again engage in measurement to see, did it work or not? We can also assess whether there's some level of backlash. Perhaps the solution that we put in place made employees upset, and so actually now we're worse off, and then we definitely want to try another solution. But if we put in place solutions but don't measure before and after, we cannot assess whether they actually work. The final thing that I think is important for business leaders to do as they're attempting to address diversity, equity, and inclusion is to message appropriately. Explain to your constituents why this policy is being put in place, how you'll know that it works, and make the case for the value of this outcome and addressing this outcome to the business, to everybody in the company as well. Sometimes leaders just put in place policies and don't message well around them. And I think messaging well is the first step to creating the support needed in the organization for these solutions to be successful.